So I think we are gonna get into Flutterwave. So for our audience who don't know what Flutterwave, do you mind telling us what it is?
Right. So essentially it's a fintech startup which specializes in payment solutions. So stuff like payment gateways, payment fulfillment, when you use your card to make a payment on the website, that sort of thing. So basically, the financial infrastructure that makes it such that when you make an electronic payment, the money goes from your bank account or wherever to the bank account of the merchant you're making the purchase from. That whole ecosystem of financial infrastructure, Flutterwave is one of, or is the biggest uh, startup operating in that space on the African continent. It's Africa's highest valued startup. It's valued just north of $3 billion. So it's Africa's highest valued tech startup. Um, it's called a unicorn because any startup with a valuation in excess of $1 billion is called a unicorn. So that's what Flutterwave is right now. Um, sometime this actually started way back in 2021, right? I'd heard whispers. I mean, this was at this point, this was pretty much sort of like social media gossip. It wasn't anything that I even had any interest in, but I'd heard whispers that there were things that were less than acceptable going on behind the scenes at Flutterwave, right? I'd heard whispers about things like bosses sleeping with their subordinates that they work with, that sort of thing. But the thing is, so in the Nigerian context, that's not really a scandal because in the Nigerian context, I mean, if you were to do an investigation into every business where a boss sleeps with his subordinates, I mean, you would never run out of investigations, basically. So again, as terrible as it sounds, in the Nigerian context, that's just not a scandal. It's just, it's like saying someone stole a piece of meat from his mother's pot or something. It's so common that, so it wasn't something I had really much interest in at the time. What changed was when I then started getting a series of anonymous emails from a character that I named in the story, right? Some anonymous character called Echo Minaj. Right. This person got hold of my encrypted email address, which I thought was interesting because I hadn't put that email address into the public domain. Like a few people had that email address. It's a Proton email address, an encrypted email address. It's not something I publicized. So for this person to have, you know, done that amount of sort of background research into me to even get hold of my encrypted email address that wasn't public, just for the fact that this person put that much effort into tracking down my encrypted email address, where because my public email address, I get loads of tips there on a daily basis. If we're lucky, I might get to work on one out of every 20 or one out of every 30 story tips there, because often they're not very high quality tips. But this person found my encrypted email address and started emailing me consistently and persistently. And it wasn't just random emails. These were emails, like the email threads that were attached to these emails had some very interesting information in them. Now, at the time, it's one thing to just see information in an email, but if there are no receipts, as we call them, if there's no evidence, you can't really do much with it, right? It's just, anyone can make an allegation and put the allegation in writing. It doesn't make it true. And in my line of work, because of the kind of journalism that I do, I always make a point that even if I know for a fact that something is true, if I can't visually prove it, if I don't have the visual evidence to prove it, I simply don't publish it, no matter how true I know it is. Like if I know, for example, that your name is Renatos, like unless I have a printout from your national identity card or your passport data page proving that this is your name, and I can actually publish that in my story, then I simply won't say it, right? Because um, how it works in my line of work is the minute you publish anything that can be contested in any way, you have completely lost all your credibility. That's how it works. You can spend 10 years building credibility and it takes one story or it takes one part of one story to completely destroy it. That's just how it is. You're only as good as your last performance. That's how it works in this line of work. It's not fair, but it's how it is. You can't fight it. So sometimes, so I started receiving these emails around September 2021. I didn't really do much with them because there wasn't really much that I could do with them. What changed was in March, I think. No, February 2022, when someone else then reached out to me, someone who had no knowledge of this other person, but it's also about Flutterwave. And this time it was basically a complaint about unpaid or stolen stock options, basically. That basically when this person got a job or was offered a job at Flutterwave, it was stated in the offer letter that they would be offered stock options, right? So how stock options work, for those who don't know, is when you start work at a startup which has a high growth potential, part of how the startup compensates you in addition to a salary, especially in an environment like Africa, where they might not be able to pay you the high salary that you get in Silicon Valley. So how they sort of make up for that to prevent them losing you as talent to maybe Silicon Valley, since you are at the same level of expertise as people who work in Silicon Valley, how they compensate you is they give you something called stock options. Now, how stock options work is, let's say this company has a total of 100,000 shares. Each share is valued at $10. So when you are coming in, maybe you are given stock options for 1,000 shares. Now, the idea is if you stay with the company for a particular period of time, maybe 4 years or 5 years, then your stock options will vest. Vest means they mature and you can actually sell them, you can cash them out. And hopefully by that time, the value of these stocks would have actually risen, especially if the company has been able to raise money 2 or 3 times. Because each time the company raises money, the total valuation of the company goes up and the share price or the stock price goes up as well. So when you hear the announcement saying a company has done a Series A funding, that means the company has raised money for the first time. It's done a Series B funding, is raised money for the second time, Series C like that, and so on and so forth. So I think Flutterwave at the time had done its Series C funding. It had just raised $178 million for a total valuation of $3 billion. So I think each share at the time was worth something like $20. Bear in mind that just a few weeks before the raise, each share was worth about $3.50. So a few weeks after the raise was announced, the share price has gone up to about $20. Now, this person was complaining that even though she stayed for the stipulated time, she wasn't given her stock options, basically. And that basically the reason she wasn't given her stock options, like she was not officially awarded the stock options, was because she refused to sleep with the boss, right? Because the boss basically was running the office as a slaughterhouse, to put it in street lingo. So basically, if he sleeps with you, then hopefully you will get what you want. And if you refuse to sleep with him, then you don't get anything. Also, the story went. So that was like the second thing that kind of piqued my interest. Why that one piqued my interest a bit more was there were legal documents attached, because this person had actually gone to the National Industrial Court. There was actually like an ongoing lawsuit as well. So I had access to like a plethora of files, which were on public record. So that was good. And then what then made me decide, okay, I'm actually really going to do a story about this, was the very next month, I think it was, then a whistleblower from within the company who had left only recently then reached out to me. And this time, and they had a ton of receipts, right? And receipts, as a journalist, receipts are my favorite things, right? Because with receipts, your story can be established beyond any point of doubt or beyond any reproach, right? Because when you report a story and it's he said versus she said, how it works in Nigeria or in Africa, in fact, is that people will just say that you're lying, you made it up. That somebody paid you to demarket X person or X organization. You're not a real journalist. You should go back to journalism school, or you've collected a brown envelope. Somebody bribed you. You're a terrible person. That's what you get normally. if you can't publish, visual evidence. So I love receipts, and this person had all of the receipts. So then I started working on the story. Now, it was very interesting that almost around that exact time, Flutterwave then got into a public dispute with another one of its ex-employees, a lady called Clara Odero. And she's Kenyan. And basically, the complaints that she made publicly when there was this back and forth between herself and Flutterwave were also very useful in putting parts of the story together, right? So in April last year was when the story was published. Now, I'm not sure I want to sort of like give it like a whole outline of the story all over again, so that we don't take too much time. So I'll just spend like 1 minute running through it. So essentially there were three parts of the story. So the first part was the lady that I said who was in court with Flutterwave for not being awarded her stock options. So there was that. So there was this whole thing about stock options at Flutterwave. So it wasn't just her. There were other people who, for all sorts of arbitrary reasons, were either not awarded their stock options, or even if they were awarded stock options, they weren't allowed to sell them at market price. So if, as I said, the stocks were worth $20, they're only allowed to sell to a particular an investment vehicle called Berrywood Capital, which was owned by the CEO himself, GB. So essentially, you're only allowed to sell your shares to the CEO of the company himself, and then he would tell you at what price he would buy it from you. So the market value is $20. He'll buy it from you for $3.50. Right? So you get like a tiny fraction of the value of what you've actually worked for. And then obviously, being that he has got these highly valued shares at this very steep discount, he can then go to the secondary market and then sell those shares at their true value and pocket the difference for himself. And then put that money back into Berrywood Capital. And, so it's like he was running a scam on his own employees, basically. So Berrywood Capital became like his little slush fund. It is his little slush fund. And another thing that was very interesting while putting that story together was that I then came to realize that Berrywood Capital owns significant stakes in pretty much every major significant Nigerian tech company you can think of, pretty much all of them. So basically, the very interesting thing when putting this story together was that the number of people who, when I tried to speak to them, as soon as they heard the name Flutterwave, would just completely lock up on me. They didn't want to talk. And it's basically because the founder of Flutterwave is on their cap table. He's on everybody's cap table in the tech industry in Nigeria or in West Africa. He owns everybody, basically. So that's how he sort of kept himself protected for all these years. So regardless of whatever chicanery was going on under the hood, no one ever went after him, because this guy is basically, this guy, he's in everybody's investment cap table. His money's in everybody's pockets.
Got everyone on the payroll.
Yeah, exactly. That's how he kept himself ring-fenced. So there was that. There was the issue with stock options, which, by the way, according to the Securities and Exchange Commission in America, is classified as fraud. And bear in mind, Flutterwave is registered in Delaware, so it's an American corporation technically. So it's subject to US law. So there was that. Then the second bit, and in my opinion, the most important bit, which most people didn't realize was the most important bit, but the most important bit was the bit about insider dealing and fraud at Flutterwave. Now, insider dealing being that the founder of Flutterwave, a guy called Benga Agbola, or GB as is popularly known, for 2 years while he was building Flutterwave, was still working at Access Bank concurrently without the knowledge of the bank. Now, Flutterwave was essentially built out using Access Bank resources. Was essentially the CEO of Access Bank basically was under the impression that this guy was building out a solution called Capture Payment Solutions for Access Bank. And instead, this technology solution he was building was actually Flutterwave under the hood, right? And it wasn't registered to Access Bank or to the CEO of Access Bank, so it was registered to GB. So he essentially used the resources of a bank. And by the way, Access Bank is, I think, the second largest bank by cap volume in Nigeria. So it's a huge bank in Nigeria, right? So use the resources of a bank to build out a tech startup, and was essentially directing traffic from the bank basically to Flutterwave. So essentially, if you were doing business with Access Bank at the time, if you were doing any kind of payment fulfillment using Access Bank at the time, you found yourself using Flutterwave, because GB, who was in charge of that part of Access Bank, was also the founder of Flutterwave. So he was sort of, how do I use the word? He was cannibalizing Access Bank to build out his own, to benefit his own private corporate interests. So for example, Uber Nigeria, bear in mind, Uber is a huge global business. Uber came into Nigeria within what, eight months of Flutterwave approaching them. Uber started processing all their payments in Nigeria via Flutterwave. How is that possible? A new company, and Uber becomes one of your first clients. How is that possible? How did that happen?
And Uber is a massive company.
Exactly. And the reason that happened is because Uber was processing through Access Bank. And then this was pushed to Flutterwave, right? So there was a huge thing about insider dealing there, which is also illegal, by the way, both under US law and Nigerian law. And then the other thing, the fraud bits, which in my opinion was why Flutterwave got into trouble in Ghana and Kenya, and I think in South Africa as well. Essentially, the company was doing some very shady things under the hood. One of the things that we're doing was overstating the number and volume of transactions that they were doing. Now, bear in mind that this is a company that makes money by charging a fee on every transaction it processes. So the higher the number of transactions it processes, the more the money it makes. And the more the money it makes, as far as the investor is concerned, the higher the value of the company, right? So in South Africa, for example, what they were doing was, because they were also processing for Uber in South Africa. So what would happen, for example, is you take an Uber ride in Joburg or Cape Town, and maybe the fare is 10 rands. Instead of that revenue getting booked as 10 rands, it will get booked as 10 USD. So with a stroke of the pen, you have multiplied the actual amount of revenue by 12 or by 10 times, right? Obviously, the actual amount of money that's come into the company isn't that amount. It's still the 12 rands that came in. It wasn't $12. But on the books, you recorded it as $12. So what you present to the investors is this like hyperinflated thing that doesn't actually exist, right? Something else they were doing in Nigeria, they were doing this thing called double charging. So you would make a payment, maybe you'd buy flight tickets, because at the time they were processing, I think, for Arik Air. So the flight ticket cost maybe 50,000 naira. And what would always happen is you would get debited for 50,000 naira twice, and then 50,000 naira would be reverted to you. So you only paid 50,000 naira, right? However, there are two transactions on the books. There are two
on the books.
Yeah, there are two 50,000 naira credit transactions on the books. So for every 50,000 naira transaction you've made on Arik using Flutterwave has booked 100,000 naira. And that's what it's showing to the investors. So there was just all sorts of fraud going on under the hood. Something else they were doing, I don't know if they stopped doing this, was, what was it now? This wasn't even like transactional fraud. This was more of like a tangential kind of fraud. There was a time, I think this was in 2018, or was it 2019? There was this huge consumer data leak from Arik Air that was noticed. Some guy on GitHub, some American guy, I think, noticed that he was able to get into the what's it called, like an unsecured data bucket containing thousands of Nigerian consumers' information, card details and stuff, customers of Arik Air. And there was a huge scandal at the time. And what this whistleblower within it, because at the time, Flutterwave came out and denied that they had anything to do with it. They said the problem was from Eric, and Eric said the problem wasn't from them. So it was like this hot potato. And in Nigeria, the news cycle moves really quickly, so everyone just kind of forgot, swept under the carpet. But this whistleblower revealed that it was actually Flutterwave that was hacked, basically, because they stored this info. Consumers' financial information was stored in unsecured buckets in plain text format, unencrypted. So basically, some guy from GitHub who wasn't even a hacker per se was able to get into this data bucket and find people's debit card details, all sorts of things like that, like thousands. So you can imagine what that potentially had done, the number of people whose financial details had potentially been exposed.
Was at risk.
Why was that done? Apparently because the web hosting at the time, and when the source told me this, I almost didn't want to believe it because it just sounded so crazy. But the source insisted that this actually happened. Apparently at the time, the company's web hosting wasn't being done with Amazon Web Solutions. It was being done with some random company, which apparently the co-founder's mom owned. So basically, the company is paying for web hosting at the level of AWS, but
Amazon.
it's some backroad hosting company
In the garage,
which obviously cannot do it at the same level that AWS can do it. So someone is pocketing the difference. So at every step of the way, this company that on the outside looks like this marvelous, fantastic African success story, the founders are literally just eating the company from
pocketing the
within.
money.
Yeah, they're literally eating the company and deceiving investors. Now, for me, what was probably the most interesting part of this section of the story was that this whistleblower also made it very clear to me that the investors knew all of this.
They knew what was going on?
They knew what was going on because they had been tipped off multiple times. However, and this is a very important thing, apparently how tech investment works, not just in Africa, but in the world, is we don't really care whether you do the things you claim you are doing. What we care about is that stock price should keep going up. And when it reaches a certain target level, we sell our stock, we take our profits, and we leave the bag for the greater fool who bought it. You understand?
Sign out.
Yeah, that greater fool marketplace theory, that apparently is how tech investment works, not just in Africa, but in Silicon Valley as well, across the world, which is why you keep on seeing these high-profile incidences of fraud in tech, because the investors are not stupid. They know. However, all of them are like, you know what? If we start pulling out our money now, we start panicking, we're all going to take a loss because it's going to quickly become apparent that this company is a lie. So instead, let's all keep speaking positively about it. Let's all keep pumping that price. Let's all keep giving everyone the impression that this company is growing so that the price keeps trending upward. And then let's quietly sell down our stake and then exit and then leave it for someone else. Yeah, let someone else carry the bag. So the investors all knew about this. They were not in the dark about it. They had been tipped off multiple times. And they were like, you know what? Something else, before I go to the final section of the story, something else that they were also doing was one of the co-founders, a guy called Adeleke Adekoya. So he also worked at Access Bank. So both he and GB were working at Access Bank, and we're also founding Flutterwave concurrently. So it was so weird because it got even to the point of the email signatures. They edited their Flutterwave email signatures to not include their names. So if, for example, someone is sending an email, someone is forwarding an email from the Flutterwave CEO to anybody in Access Bank, it doesn't show Benga Agbola, it shows co-founder. So basically they were hiding their involvement in Flutterwave from their own colleagues at Access Bank. So there's actually a WhatsApp exchange that I published in the story where GB is speaking to a subordinate and he's telling him that there's like a remote meeting and that he's going to attend this meeting as Access Bank. So it's a Flutterwave meeting with Access Bank, and GB is attending that meeting as the Access Bank representative.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
It's absolutely insane. So just the sheer amount of audacity involved. So he's because he's actually working at Access Bank. He is actually the Access Bank representative in that meeting, but he's intentionally it's like a staged meeting almost. The point of it is to push business to Flutterwave, right? So the person who is representing Flutterwave has been coached on what to say, while GB and Leke are representing Access Bank supposedly, even though they have financial interest in Flutterwave, they own it. So that's how that works. So apparently, this co-founder, this Adeleke Adekoya fellow, was actually also he was actually fired from MasterCard because it was discovered that he was using his so okay, let me back up a bit. After officially like resigning from Access Bank a couple of years later, and then GB stayed on at Flutterwave. Leke moved on from Flutterwave after a while, moved on to a role at MasterCard. He then got fired from MasterCard. And apparently the reason was he was using his position at MasterCard to push business toward Flutterwave, where he had a financial interest. Apparently an undisclosed financial interest. So apparently the people at MasterCard didn't really know that this person we've just given a job to potentially has a huge conflict of interest here, because this person has a financial stake in this company, which in some ways is our client, but in some ways also our competitor. They didn't know that. So he's basically like taking MasterCard, like speaking to MasterCard clients directly and telling them, hey, come and process with Flutterwave. We can give you this and that incentive, that sort of thing. And obviously, the more people who are coming to process with Flutterwave, the higher the stock value of Flutterwave goes, the more money is in his own pockets. You know how that works. And then the final part of the story, which probably the least interesting part of the story, but which most people picked up on because that's what got their senses pulsing, was the sexual environment at Flutterwave. So apparently, and that's where this Echo Minaj character comes in. Because this was apparently a lady at Flutterwave who considered herself to be a scorned woman. Because apparently she had slept with GB multiple times, both GB and the COO, a guy called Ife Orioke. Both men are married, by the way, with children. Just putting that out there. So apparently she had slept with both of them multiple times because she had been promised that she was going to get, stock options. I don't think she was entitled to stock options, but I think she had been promised that she was going to get stock options. And then like they used her as a plaything. And then she realized that they were also using the other ladies in the office as playthings as well. And that basically none of them was going to get anything. Like these men were pretty much just having fun with them and pretty much using them as toys by dangling that promise of stock options in front of them. Because the truth is that those stock options can be life-changing. And people do things they wouldn't normally do when money is involved. So if someone is dangling stock options worth $800,000 in front of your nose, you might consider yourself to be like a church girl and all that. But when you see $800,000 dangling in front of your nose, then you discover your inner bad bee,
Become is to fall for it.
Exactly, which is pretty much what was happening. So she led this email campaign, this very angry email campaign to Flutterwave investors, informing them about all the things that have been happening. And apparently it was even, I think she was actually partly responsible for tipping off investors as to what was going on within Flutterwave, even financially. But the investors did nothing about it. So there's some of the big global tech investment funds you can think of, Greycroft, Tiger, they're all invested in Flutterwave. And they did absolutely nothing. We're very happy. You know what? This guy is making us money. This stock price only keeps going up. So, whatever people have to say, that's not really our business. We are here to make money. We're not here to be HR, basically. So, there are two secret recordings which are embedded in that story. The first one was a town hall meeting that was held shortly after investors received one of those emails from this Echo Minaj person, and they called a meeting with GB. And I think that email actually got to a potential investor, someone who was in talks with Flutterwave. And because of that email, that fund backed out. So I think there was something like $20 million or something that sort of left because of that email. So GB was really angry. So he called this town hall, and he was basically trying to address these things about sexual harassment. And essentially, what he was saying in the tape recording, which is in the story, was that, look, what people do, what adults do outside of working hours is not anybody else's business. So essentially, like what he was saying was that whether he's sleeping with his subordinates or not, it doesn't concern anybody. As long as it's consensual, as long as it's not rape, he's not doing anything wrong. So, and then, that he's gonna start, instituting like office surveillance to make sure that, people like this don't hurt the company again. So then they started putting like keyloggers and spyware on people's work computers, that sort of thing, to try and smoke out who the rat was. They never successfully found out who the person was. I mean, I have my hunches, but obviously, I'm not going to say who I think it is or who I believe it is, but that's fine. And then the second secret recording I was able to get was of somebody who, I mean, I think her identity is pretty much public now, but I'm not going to say it. So let's just, I'll use the name that was assigned to her in the story, right? So the name that was given to her in the story was Tammy, I think. So this was a phone call, a call recording of her speaking to someone, and in that recording, she's basically saying that, look, the day she writes a blog post and tells the world about what she witnessed at Flutterwave and the things that happened at Flutterwave, that she's going to shut the company down. And basically what that recording was the inference in that recording was basically she was the one who was most affected by this sexual impropriety, because apparently she was well known around the office for being, for lack of a better term, GB's toy. Right? GB was toying with a lot of women, but she specifically was known in the office for being the one who is GB's toy. To the point where she's the one that he takes with him to go on trips to the US, and like account only pays for one hotel room, and both of them are lodging in the same hotel room, that sort of thing. So it wasn't exactly a secret. You understand? That sort of thing. So there's a secret recording of her, which is embedded in the story. I kind of like use digital tools to alter her voice a bit. So I pitched it down so people can, like, her voice wouldn't be like identifiable. And then I subtitled it. So yeah, it was a story that raised a lot of dust. I was informed actually by an investor who called me the day after it was published. He said that story on its own might have shaved off maybe $100 million worth of market value from the company, just that story on its own. So that should give you an idea of the extent to which certain people don't like me. Because I mean, if you're costing people that kind of money, then
yeah, I don't suppose they're happy with that.
No, they're not at all.
Wow, that's a very detailed analysis. And how did people react after you had published the article? What was the reaction like?
It was mostly so there was a perception that I had some kind of a personal grouse with the company, because there are a number of people who are affiliated with the company. Because one funny thing that company used to do, or still does, was instead of just being like a simple tech startup, which it is, it tries to sort of like portray itself as some sort of like sexy lifestyle brand or something. And it's literally it's a payment gateway. Payment gateways have existed since the 80s in the developed world. But it tries to sort of position itself as this sort of super sexy, 23rd century kind of thing, because it's like an internet-based. So They hire influencers on social media. They sponsor podcasts. They sponsor Big Brother Niger, by the way. They do a lot of like really youthful and hip stuff. So there are a number of people, some of whom I don't like and some of whom don't like me, who are affiliated with the company in that way. They have sponsorships and work with the company. So there was this mistaken perception that, oh, because David doesn't like this person, that's why David is going after this person's sponsor. But then when you read the full story, it becomes very clear that, okay, um this is not like a surface attack on a company that somebody doesn't like. This is a very detailed investigation into fraud, right? This is something very serious going on here. So the initial reaction was, for like an hour or so, was like skepticism that, let me read this thing first. And then afterwards it becomes, oh my God, how is this company still open? Like, why isn't the EFCC, that's the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, why aren't they doing anything? Why isn't the central bank doing anything? Like, this is open fraud happening, blah, 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 blah. And that was pretty much the reaction. And then, as usual, Nigeria being Nigeria, nothing happened.
Nothing happened. How did that make you feel, given all the work that you've put into write such a piece?
So again, I'm not going to pretend that I'm Iron Man. I'm not. It does piss me off. That, and it's not just that story. It's a recurring thing actually in some of the work that I do. So I would say 40% of the stories that I do end up having a definite measurable impact. So there are some stories, for example, I did an investigation into Chinese loan sharks in Nigeria last year, these loan apps. And like maybe 40 days after the story was published, the very entities that I examined in the story, they were raided by the FCCPC, they were shut down, and a probe was instituted. The banks involved, the consulting company involved, and the apps themselves, they were forced to go into hiding. So a lot of the time, my stories have that kind of definite measurable impact. That's like 40% of the time. But the other 60% of the time, you do this very, very, very detailed, elaborate story that basically does the work of the police for them. And literally all they have to do is go and make an arrest. Like, the work has been done for you. It's been laid on a platter for you. Take. And then nothing happens. And it's the most frustrating thing in the world. It's so incredibly frustrating. So like in this case, like they actually faced more consequences outside of Nigeria as a consequence of that story than within Nigeria. So in Ghana, for example, shortly after the story was published, the Ghanaian, the GCB, that's the Bank of Ghana, sorry, that's the Ghanaian Central Bank, put out a circular basically stating that no bank in Ghana is permitted to work with this company anymore and any longer. Till today, that ban persists, right? That was a result of this story. But within Nigeria, which is the biggest jurisdiction where this company operates, and which was where the audience of this story was for, nothing happened. And obviously, I couldn't put this in the story, but the reason why nothing happened, I was informed categorically by that whistleblower within the company again, but because there were no receipts, I couldn't publish it. But this is a podcast, so I'm going to say it. Basically, there are elements within the Nigerian Central Bank who have financial interest in Flutterwave. So essentially, the regulator is not neutral. The regulator also has an interest here. So it's not in the regulator's personal interest for them to regulate, because if they do their job, then, this company is going to lose share valuation or whatever. They're going to lose money. They're going to lose the source of income. So instead, just sort of look the other way and pretend that this huge investigation that the world is talking about didn't happen. Because it was huge. I mean, it made it to, it was, LinkedIn has this daily, basically like they push like the most interesting or the most important articles from the previous day, like 3 of them, they push to all their users globally. This story was on that the day after it was published. LinkedIn pushed this story, like, and so this story went around the world. Everyone read it, except in Nigeria, where the government just decided that they were going to avert their eyes and pretend that nothing happened. To date, there has been not a single enforcement action taken against this company in Nigeria.
I mean, and I wouldn't be surprised, because clearly you have people above the chain who are pulling the strings.
Exactly.